Wetherspoon's boss, Tim Martin, has demanded a top scientist publish evidence of the link between indoor drinking in pubs and cases of coronavirus. Martin's comments come after Professor Hugh Pennington said that the recent Aberdeenshire outbreak was linked to drinking in pubs. Professor Pennington said in one media interview that pubs were risky for virus spread as hot and steamy environments help COVID-19 get about. Tim Martin, whose company has more than 870 pubs in the UK, has now challenged the top bacteria expert to publish his findings so they can be properly peer reviewed. We did invite Tim Martin onto the programme, but he declined our invitation. However, we can speak to Professor Hugh Pennington on this very point. Hugh, good afternoon, sir.
Hi there.
Nice to have you with us. So you've almost been challenged by Mr. Martin here.
Yeah, a challenge I'm happy to accept. I mean, the evidence that pubs are bad places to be when the virus is about is very clear. And for epidemiologists and microbiologists like myself, looking at outbreaks is the best way of finding out, how viruses and how bacteria spread. I would draw the analogy between, specialists in earthquakes. A seismologist looks at earthquakes to find out what happens.
Sure.
They study it in the abstract, and it's the same with outbreaks of infection. That you look at the outbreak, and we know that for COVID-19. Being in a pub is a dangerous place to be when the virus is about. At least it's much more dangerous than being outside, for example, where we know the transmission rate is about 20 times less than inside. That's Japanese stuff. That's been peer reviewed. And then if you look at New Zealand, where they're having a little bit of problem with imported cases, probably, but still. They had a very big pub outbreak, 77 cases, actually smaller than the one we're having in Aberdeen. And that was a pub on St. Patrick's Day where the attendees were invited to become shamrocked. And they had this very big, and unfortunately somebody died as a consequence of that outbreak. And that we've seen similar things in nightclubs, not quite pubs, but the same sort of setting in South Korea. And basically, the big problem is not so much the heat and all that kind of stuff. It's the heavy breathing and the close proximity, which is basically a good thing for the virus in the sense that it helps it to get about. And we know the heavy breathing, singing, we know is a dangerous thing to do as well if you're in a closed environment. There was a very big outbreak in Washington State in the US, which was published in their, formal government report. It's peer reviewed as anything ever is, showing that, about 80% of people in a choir practice became infected. One of the choir members was symptomatic and spread it to all the others over about 2.5 hour period. So that's the data I go on. One can't do experiments on it because, well, they wouldn't be ethical. And we used to do experiments with the common cold virus infecting people, but that was many, many years ago. And we know that the common cold doesn't kill people. With COVID-19, I think that would be a bit tricky to get volunteers, even young volunteers. We might do, I suppose you could say, well, in the olden days in the US, they used to do experiments on prisoners and infect them with horrible bugs. Whether they'd given their consent freely, I rather doubt. I think they may have had a little bit of a revision of their sentence.
I'm sure that's true. Just tell us, Professor, if you could, is it pubs as distinct from any other similar setting? Or, I mean, if we think of, I'm thinking of a gym, and in a gym, of course, you often have a cafe area attached to a gym. Would that be the same, or is there something specific about a pub?
No, it's not specific to pubs. It's specific to places inside where there's a lot of activity going on, heavy breathing, as I was saying. And of course, in a pub, when people have had a few drinks, I mean, they're going to be socially distancing perhaps less effective than when they go in. But there have also been outbreaks in gyms. There was a classic one in South Korea with Zumba classes where they were jumping up and down. I mean, that's not strictly speaking a gym, but it's that kind of that kind of activity. That was quite a big outbreak for South Korea, kind of, and they have very good infection management and monitoring and so on. And I think these outbreaks are really very good evidence of the sort of places where you would expect to find transmission of the virus. It's not to say that every time you go to a pub or every time you go to a gym, you would catch it. It depends on whether somebody's there who's got the virus to start with. And so, just because it hasn't happened once doesn't mean to say it's not going to happen. But you've got to get that other circumstance. You've got to have somebody going in who's infectious. And we know, unfortunately, that people can be quite infectious before they get symptoms. So even if they feel fine, they may still have the virus, and breathing it out, and bingo, you've got an outbreak. And that's the evidence I'm going on, and I think that's really good scientific evidence.
So, I'm sure it is. Some would say it doesn't matter. If you think of the sort of herd immunity idea that if it's going to happen, it's going to happen anyway. So get it out the way. Take it on the chin, as somebody famous rather said.
Well, that's all right for young people because they tend not to have any hard sort of complications from the virus. But anybody over 50 is starting to get into the age group when people are going to hospital. And, the older you are, the more likely you are to have, the very severe pneumonia, which, if you're over 80, you've got a 20% chance of dying from it. And one of the reasons why we're worried about infections in young people is not the effect of the infection on the young people, but the fact that they're acting as a source of infection for older folk, which can have catastrophic effects. So that's the reason why. It's not because they fall ill, the younger folk, they don't. And they're suffering from lockdown fatigue.
Of course, yeah.
But,
we all understand that. So although Tim Martin didn't respond to us, you'd be happy to debate it with him at some other time, Hugh.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
We'll watch with interest. Thank you, Professor Hugh Pennington, Emeritus Microbiologist at the University of Aberdeen, on that point. Pub